Hello and welcome to the Center for the Study of Democracies podcast, where we connect the dots between social actors, scholars, and policymakers. Our goal is to build bridges and foster meaningful conversations that can drive positive change. Join us as we explore the complex issues that impact our society and hear from experts who are working towards solutions. I'm your host, Gloria Trifonova, and today's episode is called Unmasking Hybrid Threats, Ukraine's Battle Against Disinformation. We're joined today by Paul Massaro, who is a senior policy advisor at the US Commission on Security and Cooperation in Europe. Or, as his Twitter bio would summarize it, a foreign policy fellow fighting dictatorship and corruption. With us is also Goran Georgiev, CSD's very own disinformation expert. Let's get started. Paul and Goran, it's great to have you here. Paul, what would be your reflections on the most recent events in Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine and the Wagner coup, which was entirely brushed under the carpet, but I think definitely revealed the deepening cracks in the Kremlin?
Let me try to take these in order. So on Prigozhin's I guess people are calling it a mutiny, which is very funny because it's like a mutiny at sea, it's pirates. And they are kind of pirates because the whole place is kleptocracy. These are all thieves who sort of took control of the state in order to loot it and then, fulfill their sort of genocidal ambitions, which is that Gerasimov and Shoigu, have failed to kill Ukrainians effectively enough or fast enough, have failed to genocide the Ukrainians as is the goal. So he was going in to ensure the more rapid, more effective genocide of the Ukrainians. And I think that even he was a little surprised as to how undefended Russia was. There's been one regional capital captured in this entire invasion, and it was in Rostov. It was in Russia. They just took it. And then the Russians come out and they give them food because they don't know who's going to be in charge in a year. Better to be on everybody's side, whoever the soldiers are, and you're, occupying your city, be nice to them because they might be in charge soon. Who knows? He gets really close to Moscow. I understand from sort of anecdotal evidence that he got even closer than was reported, that some people were seeing him. They were digging trenches around Moscow. And I think ultimately Prigozhin recognized that he was the dog that caught the bus. He got really close to essentially oh my God, turn into this huge bloody thing. So he ultimately relented and went to Belarus. He's a tactician. He's an improviser. Again, not unlike Putin. He's not a strategist. He's not playing 4D chess. He has no idea what he's doing. He's just improvising. And I think this is ultimately, you'd said it was short-lived. It was short-lived, but it was also a huge demonstration that Putin and his clique are not in control of the country, that there's no defenses, essentially. We just saw yesterday a drone blow up a part of Moscow. We should expect that Russia's going to get hit a lot more times by sort of unknown forces, whether they're the Free Legion of Russia, whether they're Wagner rebels 2.0. What do these Wagner guys think, right? Thinking wait a second, we were just told we were going to go this loot and run Russia, and then Prigozhin left at the last second in order to save his butt. That sounds pretty cowardly to me. So this prison mentality that kind of runs Russia does not respect backing down. And in this situation, both Putin and Prigozhin back down. They both look like they're weak people. I think we should be expecting a lot more instability within Russia. And in all honesty, we should be welcoming that. We shouldn't be scared of it. There's always this thing that we don't want instability in Russia because of whatever, nuclear weapons or some intellectual, gobbledygook. No, instability in Russia is good for the continent. It's good for the United States. It's good for the world because it means that they won't be able to, as effectively genocide Ukrainians and ultimately fulfill their goal of reestablishing a Russian empire.
And also, you made a couple of good points that I think people were really underestimating until recently what the so-called opposition in Russia is. Especially in the West, we tend to think of opposition as the more sort of liberal or critical. That's a lot of the times that's what we think of. But a big part of the opposition in Russia is composed of people like Prigozhin, right? Of people like Alexander Dugin, for example, who are saying things like, we are not going far enough. We are not fighting this war using all of the weapons and capabilities are at disposal. And what they're really talking about is just escalating it even further, killing more civilians, spreading wanton destruction in Ukraine. But it's something that people really underestimate, that a big part of the opposition against the Kremlin is people who are saying that it's not going far enough. And we just saw just how delicate this balance is, that the Kremlin and Putin in particular seems to be trying to achieve this sort of balance between the Kremlin itself and then even more extremist elements such as Wagner itself on the other side. At this point, I don't think anyone can really say what's actually happened, or, the agreement that Putin and the Kremlin, what exactly they came to. We can only really speculate, but it's interesting to see that it didn't turn out the way they said, right? He didn't go to Lukashenko. He's not in Belarus. He appeared in Moscow. He appeared in Africa at the summit. And he also has this quote-unquote media empire composed of all sorts of Prigozhin does, of all sorts of Telegram channels that are still continuing that whole narrative of Russia not going far enough. It's an interesting dynamic for sure. And I'm guessing that we'll keep seeing this sort of infighting even more in the future.
Yeah, definitely. And I think Putin definitely realized he wasn't looking too great when he had to make all the, appearances on national TV saying that, we need peace and we need to make amends between ourselves. But so simultaneously, this is a traitor, so I won't speak to him. It just doesn't look, it's not a good look for Russia currently. And the cracks in the system are definitely starting to get more and more evident.
Definitely. I want to say a few things, though, just to because I know there's kind of this conspiracy theory now as to whether it was like all stage managed in order to get the West to, you don't want Prigozhin, you want Putin. It's just this kind of thing that's like, no, it wasn't. Too much chaos, too crazy. I mean, this is one of those things that happens when you're in a situation like Putin has put himself in, like Russia has put itself in, where this 3-day special operation has become a nearly 2-year quagmire for them. And I also guess I want to say that we should have no fear of post-Putin. Don't let ourselves get into the situation of, the devil is better than the devil you don't. Look, ideally, the core thing we need to understand, first of all, is that the problem with Russia is Russia. It's not Russia's leader. The problem with Russia is an imperial identity that creates cohesion within Russia based on domination internally and externally, so that war, sort of an invasion, whether it's of Georgia, whether it's bombing Syria, whether it's invading, putting down, an independence movement in Ishkaria, or invading Ukraine. This sort of thing creates cohesion within Russia. It's popular because the Russian identity is built upon that. So we have a much deeper challenge in the Russian identity. Now, in the immediate term, with the post-Putin, whoever comes after, even if there's somebody that's saying okay, Russia isn't killing fast enough, but I actually think whoever it is, they're going to end the war. It's one of those things. I see this in, I hate to make this comparison, but I see this in sort of primaries in the USA all the time, right? When you're running the primary in the election, you veer to the far left or the far right to appeal to the primary voters, which is what Prigozhin or whoever is doing, saying hey, we're not doing it hard enough. We're not doing it hard. But once they take power, they're going to be we want to make money again. So everybody's leaving Russia. Everybody's leaving Ukraine. We denazified Ukraine. And then it's actually going to become incumbent upon us in sort of the United States and the EU and the G7 to have the sort of moxie to say, no, we're not just going to let you get away with it. And we're not just going to take all the sanctions off. And we're not just going to go back into the our man in Moscow mentality that we had with Putin or Yeltsin or somebody like that. The fact is real deep reform in the region requires not just a new leader, but a new political system and a new, even I would say, states form within Russia.
The whole ecosystem, kind of people around Putin, will probably start to wither away if he's changed.
No, I mean, I think that's just the thing. I think that the system's there to stay. There's two quasi exceptions to this. The system's there to stay unless the overthrow comes from without. And it's this is kind of the dark horse scenario. I mean, who knows? But unless there's kind of the guys that have gone into Belgorod before, the Legion of Free Russia or somebody like this, kind of goes and takes Moscow from without, which seems hard to believe, let's say, but is out there, I guess, as an idea. Or, there is a 30-year effort post-victory on the side of the democratic powers to isolate Russia until real change is realized. Unless we actually say we're going to keep the sanctions on, we're going to get Ukraine into NATO and the EU. We're going to fight for justice until there is sort of demilitarization, denuclearization, and decolonization within Russia, at which point we can welcome Russia into whatever is post-Russia. I sometimes compare it to the, I don't know, this might be sensitive for Bulgarian listeners, but I sometimes compare it to the collapse of the Ottoman Empire into Turkey, right? That was kind of the last major land-based empire that turned into a nation state. Now, Turkey's not perfect by any means, but Turkey's a lot less dangerous than Russia is for the world. So, it's worth considering, levels of danger, even if it's, I don't know, it is the solution that's available.
I think also the whole Prigozhin and the whole Wagner episode with the coup d'etat attempt, I think it exemplifies, similar to a lot of other events in the past, like corruption in Russia. And corruption as a model for foreign policy, this is something that a lot of people also kind of tend to underestimate, is the fact that Russia exports corruption. It exports its own governance model because that's the only way how to work, basically. In Russia, you don't really have this strict separation between the public and the private sector, for example. That's the model it knows how to work with, and it's oligarchic circles and, distributing power to them. And it's what it looks to do in Eastern European countries, including in Bulgaria, is the model that it exports. So it's one of its strengths, so to say, because it's one of its strategies, but it's also one of its weaknesses, as in you have a lot of these infighting. Corruption is also one of the reasons why it's so easy, or at least it appears to be quite easy, to infiltrate and collect sensitive information from inside Russia about its citizens, about the Kremlin itself. It also appears to be the reason why, strange as it might be, Russian military forces were hard-pressed to have the necessary supplies at their disposal in the first months of the war. And this is, 20 or 30 kilometers away from your border, and you're struggling to get supplies to your soldiers because half of those supplies have been, sold out by officers in the black market, etc., etc. So we see this, it's again this sort of fine balance between corruption as a strength and corruption as a vulnerability with Russia. And it's interesting to see how that develops further.
Yeah, I it's an excellent point, and it's essentially what I worked on prior to the full-scale invasion almost exclusively. And I guess I want to say pretty plainly, the West failed. It basically fell victim to Russian corruption. I think, Germany more than anybody, but not just Germany, of course, also London and the UK, also France, François Fillon and others that have gone to work for Russia. Obviously, Austria, which is basically an oblast of Russia, and in the United States, let's not have any illusions about America's supposed sort of immunity to this kind of thing. It's also susceptible to Russian corruption. So, it's Russia's, you're exactly right. Russia is extremely good at this kind of external weakening via corruption and disinformation, which really always go together, right? It's kind of the corruption and then the lying about it. I've kind of come to, I use the term disinformation because it's so well known, but disinformation is lying, and Russia is lies. Russia, the whole place is built on lies. Its whole basically culture is lying and theft and taking things. And it's so dangerous because we fall for this sort of thing. The West is particularly susceptible to it because of this, mentality of like, well, anybody can become something different and everybody deserves a second chance and we can integrate everybody and we have this transformative effect because liberalism is so powerful. And, at the end of the day, I think we were all shocked in the West that like Russia would really give up this much economic might to commit a genocide. That's what this place is. This is a place where in their identity, it is worth more to who they are and their cohesion and their national identity to kill hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians and really to conquer and reestablish empire than it is to make a buck. And just making a buck, that's influence, whereas in the West, that's the whole game. Like we can't even imagine, like, why would anybody give up this much money? So much money on the table.
But so why do you think that happened? Like, why did we let it go so far from the 2000 onward, or even before? Russia had like unfettered access to Western financial system. It's been abusing that. And even 2014, Germany didn't stop the Nord Stream project. It continued on. Like, why was it? Is it money motivation?
Yeah, it started Nord Stream 2. It started the project. Imagine you get invaded and the first thing you do is make a deal with your adversary. It's just crazy. Like, yeah, okay, like I see you invaded us. Let's build a bridge. Let's build a pipeline. Like, what?
And Merkel is out there talking about economic projects, right? So how?
Absolutely. It's humiliating. I mean, in hindsight, it seems almost incomprehensible. I have termed this liberal triumphalism. And I think that the West and the United States and our close Western allies in particular, we fell into this kind of malaise after the Cold War, after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, in which we built this myth that democracy's triumph was inevitable. And there were a lot of sort of reasons to believe this. I mean, I guess first and foremost, it's that nobody expected the end of communism in the West. I mean, it kind of came out of nowhere because all these peoples, including the Bulgarians, right? I mean, liberated themselves from communism. We didn't really do anything. I mean, we just sat over here being in the 80s and having Ronald Reagan or whatever, and then suddenly it was like the entire Eastern Bloc just fell apart. And it was like, and I mean, even looked like the Chinese were going to give up communism for a moment. And it was like, maybe we don't have to do anything. Maybe the best we can do is just sit over here and make money and the world will just go right, And I mean, of course, this ignores, how much money and influence and everything else we put into our military and covert operations and everything else in order to fight communism. I mean, we did an enormous amount of work to keep communistic influence out of our system. I mean, it was like our religion almost to fight communism. So I mean, we did a lot to fight communism, but from the outside, it kind of felt like, wow, this whole thing just collapsed under its own contradictions. Maybe this is just how autocracy is. Maybe these dictatorial systems are just inevitably going to become democracies. Now, we have believed this for the last 30 years, and we believed it at first because of this incredible, historic, wonderful, enormous step for humanity, and that is the collapse of communism in Central and Eastern Europe and Eurasia, which is just a wonderful thing. But eventually, we should have kind of known better, within a few years, because things weren't really moving in the right direction. But then this odd thing started happening where our political elite started making lots of money lobbying for these guys and working for these guys and consulting for these guys and advising these guys. And then this myth, sort of the myth got mixed with greed. It got kind of solidified, fortified by how much money we were making and how much we didn't want the system to disappear, and then the system began to kind of self-reinforce by saying that, like, okay, well, and it kind of became the Washington corruption system, to be honest, where you'd go into government and you'd be nice to everybody and everybody would thank you and you'd help break down trade barriers with China and Russia. And then afterward, you'd go work for Huawei or Hikvision or a Russian oligarch or some of the bad Ukrainian oligarchs. And they exist, some of the bad Bulgarian oligarchs, whatever, some of the people that were really trying to undermine democracy in these countries. Or heck, again, we should have no illusion, work for a German industrial association or a German company. That's basically just a front for Russian influence. So, I mean, it became a whole Washington ecosystem, and not just Washington, London, Paris, Berlin. This became the ecosystem of all these places, which is only just now breaking down. But let's have no illusions. I mean, it's still very strong. It has broken down a little bit because the Ukrainians have defended all of us and shown us what it means to actually stick to your values and shaken us awake. But we need to get back. We really need to get back to kind of the core essence of our country, which has always been this wonderful Jeffersonian phrase of eternal vigilance is the price of liberty. There's nothing easy about democracy. There's nothing automatic. You have to wake up every single day and you have to fight for it. And you have to fight for it in Congress, you have to fight for it in Parliament, you have to fight for it on the fields of battle, like the Ukrainians are doing. I mean, it's historically autocracies have extinguished democracy more than the other way around. That's just the reality. Most of human history has been lived under dictatorship. So we should be grateful that we live in this wonderful moment with the shining light of democracy, but also recognize how fragile it is and how not normal it is to live in a society where people respect one another and where people have freedoms and this sort of thing. The reality in human history is to rally around the strong man, to kill the other. These are the things that are that drive us. The rationality is the exception.
No, I think you're definitely right in the fact that probably a lot of countries in the West got really complacent after the fall of the Soviet Union, and they thought it's all solved now, we can just move forward and everything will be fine. And kind of slowly you can see all these kind of autocratic regimes slipped right past the West, just over a decade, slowly centralizing power, creating an oligarchy. And then you end up with a country that's attacking another country in the 21st century. And you're like, what's going on,
And just to corroborate these points, even now after the invasion, we're at this weird sort of place where a lot of leaders are anyway. You have the French president essentially amplifying the Kremlin's information operations. I think you could definitely define it like that, but also saying things like, we need to look for strategic autonomy outside of NATO. But from a more serious practical perspective, it's like, what are you really talking about? You can barely project power. I don't just mean France. I mean the whole continental Europe and the UK. We can barely project power in North Africa or the Middle East. So what exactly strategic autonomy are you actually talking about? Or how are you talking about Russia's security guarantees when it's waging a war of aggression against Ukraine? It's also, I think one of the things I'm worried about now is that we will repeat some of these same mistakes with China. And it's interesting to follow the discourse in Germany regarding their new strategy vis-a-vis China. And of course, the whole approach of decoupling, which ended up turning into de-risking, but you're still seeing a lot of pushback, for example, from German business, with China being, at the core of its profits. It's like you said, it's a never-ending battle of determination and convincing people, not just governments, but also private actors who go and do business in these countries. And a lot of the time, they don't really have a choice, or they even voluntarily step into this corrupt world and they adopt those practices, whether it be in Russia or in China. What would be your 2 cents on the approach for China? Are we repeating the same mistakes? Is de-risking the way forward?
Yes, and then many other things, like it's necessary but not sufficient, but it is necessary. And some level of decoupling is necessary. And I think we absolutely, Goran, you're 100% correct. We should recognize kind of the systemic, incredible threat that China poses. And a lot of people aren't, and they absolutely are making the same mistakes. Again, we just saw like Scholz overrule his own cabinet to sell a part of Hamburg port to the Chinese, which just, it's crazy at this point. It's like, have you learned nothing? Like, what is the problem? I guess it's complacency, but it's worse than complacency. It's like enforced complacency. It's like there are people that are screaming from the rooftops that our house is on fire, and yet we've got all these people outside like paying the elites to say look the other way, or telling you no, it's just the heating. It's absolutely terrifying the extent to which we're under attack. But we kind of there are a lot of people who are making a lot of money in an effort to have us ignore it, and that's exactly what happened in the Russia case, and that's why we have war, and that's we're on our way to it in the China case. Now, we could have prevented it in the Russia case. We could have prevented it with, very serious sanctions, with arming the Ukrainians to the teeth sort of much earlier, with responding seriously to the invasion of Georgia. With responding seriously to Russians crushing the independence movement in Ishkeria. You really need to nip it in the bud when autocrats are weak. That's the best point. Now, we've missed that opportunity with China. China is strong. There is kind of a interdependencies that have been established. And of course, I don't want to advocate like the, massive discomfort and the crushing of the American and European economies in an effort to decouple from China. But we can do this very strategically. And we should also recognize that we are holding a better hand than they are, right? The big key for us, and when I say us, I mean the democratic world, is we need stronger integration among one another. We need stronger synchronization among one another. China's only hope, really, because look, they have no financial power basically at all. Nobody trusts the renminbi. Nobody wants to own Chinese currency because they know it can be expropriated. They know the rule of law is insecure. The big thing the Chinese have is economic power. They have a huge workforce, which is also translated into a huge consumer market. And those are kind of the really major economic advantages. They also have a massive army. But the thing with the army and the military is just like with Russia, we have no idea how powerful it really is. Nobody wants to find out. We thought that Ukraine would fall in 3 days because of what we knew about the Russian military, but it turned out all of our highly paid military analysts were wrong. The Russian military is a joke. All it can do is kill civilians, every indication would be that the PLA is not different. That's not to say we should test it out. We shouldn't. I don't want to go to war. We should deter war. That's the goal. But I think that Xi Jinping is looking at Ukraine right now very, very closely and looking at Russia's invasion and thinking, oh my God, what if the same thing happens with Taiwan? What if we invade? Turns out the PLA is extremely corrupt because clearly Putin didn't think the Russian military was this bad. He was being lied to. So Xi Jinping's probably thinking, well, God, what if I'm being lied to? And the PLA has historically been corrupt, hasn't fought anything since the 70s. We have no clue what it's capable of. And neither does Xi Jinping. That's so I think the biggest, I guess, two things we can do are, as I said, synchronize our approaches, really fight for transatlantic integration. And I mean, really deep, as you would say in the EU, deep and comprehensive, but also make sure Ukraine wins this war and make sure victory is complete. 1991 borders, NATO and the EU, justice and reconstruction, and make sure China understands that an invasion of a neighbor is going to come with enormous costs, and that we are also willing to make sacrifices. I mean, the way China and Russia want to paint is the way they want to paint the EU and the United States is kind of like decadent, backwards, can't fight because they're too fat and they're too used to luxury and that sort of thing. So we have to convince them otherwise. There's no way to do that that's better than full Ukrainian victory. That'll have them believing like, oh my God, these guys still have a lot of power and they're willing to use it.
I mean, this is definitely the time to set a precedent if nothing else comes out of this, like, as you say, full victory will be deterrent to any future attempts or at least they'll think twice about it. I'm not saying it's never going to happen, but at least it will get them thinking that maybe this is not such a good idea. Because even in Bulgaria, we're seeing sometimes there's so many like Confucius centers popping up everywhere. And if you go to small villages, the mayor, for some reason, is connected to Chinese businessmen. And you're just starting to think that maybe, as you said, we should really be more vigilant and pay attention to these developments, because before we know it, it might turn into something more serious if we just let it continue happening.
But talking about the war in Ukraine, or rather Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine, because I think that's the best way to describe it, is what it really is. And talking about how to win it, and I wanted to ask you guys what your opinion was on the sort of the soft factors, I guess is what the military would say, but really all the non-material factors that go into winning the war. And in particular, how important is the information warfare outside of Ukraine? So how does that determine the conclusion of the war? Is it important that we, the democratic society, globally wins the information warfare, not just on the front per se, not just in Eastern Europe, but in societies all around the world? Now, and just to give a little context, a lot of experts and governments were really quick to sort of declare victory on the information front in the first months of the war. And this made sense for the simple fact that once a war begins, societies, people at large tend to they tend to support their governments, and they tend to be against the aggressor, and the aggressor here is clearly Russia. But then again, it really does depend on the language in society that you look at, as in it's easier to declare victory when looking at this English language, maybe. But if we look at some of the data, so for example, in 2022, the Brookings Institution found that Russian embassies in Spanish-speaking countries like Mexico and independent journalists in Latin America are among the most popular pro-Russian voices on Twitter. It was also found that RT en Español, so the Spanish language version of RT, is more successful than any of RT's other services, which also include English, Arabic, German, and French. And of course, when you also look at the narrative situation in Africa, or in Mandarin, or in the Middle East, and not to mention Eastern Europe, then it's really difficult to say that we're winning on the information front. But like, how big of a factor is that? And what would be your assessment? Like, are we winning, or how do you even define victory?
Look, because Ukraine is so determined to win the war, and because they're so committed to freedom, and because they have demonstrated such efficacy on the battlefield versus the Russian hordes, the information war has become nearly as important as the actual on-the-ground war. And that's not unique to this invasion, not unique to this war, but it is rare that that's the case. And it's the case because never has there been a more lopsided competition than Russia versus the EU and the United States and the G7. I mean, Russia has an economy the size of New York City. I mean, it's a joke. If we actually put our full support behind Ukraine. Ukraine would win tomorrow. And Ukrainians know this, and it kind of makes them a little resentful when I go there. It's always kind of like, oh my God, thank you. We wouldn't survive without you. But also, why are you holding out on us, guys? There's a true reality to the fact that, we have this whole political discourse in the United States where we say, oh, we're spending this money on Ukraine. We should spend it on our border or something like this. Okay, we have spent what amounts to a rounding error in our defense budget. I mean, you look at our national security strategy for the last years and years and years, and it's Russia, China, Russia, China, Russia, China, Russia, China. Okay, we now, just from a purely U.S. national security perspective, are seeing our second most important adversary come apart at the seams, and all it's costing us is a rounding error in our defense budget. I mean, if the info war, if there wasn't an info war, and if we'd already won, if we had whatever, Reagan's America or Truman's America, right? I mean, it would be like, oh my God, like triple, quadruple, quintuple what we're giving Ukraine. Just give them everything. Just win. I mean, geez, if we could have had this with Germany when they invaded, when Germany and Russia invaded Poland in the beginning of World War II, we could have prevented enormous loss in life and treasure in what ultimately for a moment, I mean, for a very important moment and realistically looked like the end of democracy, to be replaced with among the worst ideologies of totalitarianism ever conceived by mankind. It's extraordinary the opportunity we have thanks to the Ukrainians, and yet we fail to realize it because of the info war, because we are very much on the back foot. I mean, I think we're fending it off. Like we're not like we haven't totally lost. If we totally lost, we would have stopped giving money in the first place. But I also want to say the info war is not just what you think it is. First of all, I don't think it's primarily on Twitter. I mean, I'm obviously a big Twitter user, but I don't think it's primarily on Twitter. I think it's particularly since NATO's done a great job. You don't need to get into NATO. The Ukrainians have done an amazing job just showing how to tear through disinformation by ridiculing it, not by debunking facts, not by, just by saying it's dumb. You're dumb. Stop. It's like.
Agreed. I love their use of memes. Sorry to interrupt. Their use of memes is awesome.
Memes and ridicule are the best ways to go after disinformation. Look, but in some sense, like the audience on Twitter, there's some important influences, I guess, but the audience on Twitter, particularly since Musk's purchase, are mostly people whose minds are made up anyway. And it's not, I mean, if you're just giving people confirmation bias, it's not that big of a deal. What's actually really, and I guess I also want to say, like, you mentioned like Africa and Latin America. Look, we want to win hearts and minds in these places. But I guess I also want to say that, like, if the EU and the United States actually decided to win, we just win. Like, there's not like we in one very real way. We don't, I mean, it's not to say they're not important. I wish we had 99% of the world supporting Ukraine on this, but we have the resources to win tomorrow. It's not, all we have to do is give them to Ukraine. The really pernicious misinformation, the really pernicious lies are actually at the elite level. I mean, they're lies that are like the classic elite lie that's believed in like the majority of US universities is that NATO expansion provoked the conflict. Like, I mean, this is a very interesting one, right? Because this has been pushed by professors of international relations. It's largely viewed as kind of a legitimate argument of some sort, when in fact, like, it makes no sense at all. I mean, it makes no sense whatsoever. I mean, what, we held a gun to Bulgaria's head and forced them to join NATO? Give me a break. Like, I mean, we literally have the United States being the #1 opponent right now of Ukraine joining NATO. Like, I mean, we're not forcing anybody into NATO, quite the opposite. It's an unbelievable misinformation that masquerades as like academic and like verified and validated argument that's pushed all over the place among elite circles, taken very seriously. And this is much more pernicious than biolabs in Ukraine. Nobody actually cares about that. I mean, it's very funny when somebody goes to even the House floor and says all these lies. It resonates with people that know that want to believe it anyway, but it's not changing hearts and minds. What actually causes our policy to change is when our elites believe this very sophisticated misinformation that influences their policymaking. I'll give you another. This very pernicious misinformation that if Ukraine wins the war, Russia will break apart, which will cause instability, and therefore we want to create some kind of resolution that maintains Russia's territorial cohesion. I mean, mean, imagine if we had this perspective in World War II. Imagine if our main worry is, well, if we defeat the fascists too badly, then Germany will break apart and there will be like, what? None of this makes sense when you think about it for more than 2 seconds. But and the biggest one by far, if Ukraine starts winning seriously, Russia will use nuclear weapons. This is the ultimate level of disinformation, right? Russia wants us to believe this very, very badly, pushes it into our heads. Russia's not going to use nuclear weapons. There's a million reasons why Russia wouldn't use nuclear weapons when you start thinking about it. But they need us to believe this so we won't give Ukraine what it needs to win. So we will continue to hold back and not support Ukrainian victory. Now, these 3 pieces of misinformation have done more damage to US and EU policy than any amount of RT, bogus, biolabs, all of that stuff meant for kind of the plebs. That is irrelevant next to the elite misinformation that is actually in the heads of real decision makers who don't even realize it's misinformation. And that's what's ingenious about Russia's tactics ultimately is they fight on both planes, right? And it's almost like their absolutely outrageous misinformation. It makes their sort of more sophisticated misinformation seem more sensible. How can this be misinformation? We know what Russian misinformation is. Russian misinformation is biolabs. Russian misinformation is just the outright lies about MH17 or something like that. It can't be this, but it is. These are Russian lies. They're shaping our narrative.
No, yeah, I really love your point about the universities. You keep seeing this issue popping its head all the time in universities in both North America and Europe, and you still see it. A lot of it has to do with these really simplistic and literal interpretations of more complex theories. But what they're also missing the point is that the Kremlin and Russia itself will weaponize any academic work, any idea, and they do. If you look at the language and the content of the Kremlin's ideologues and the Kremlin itself, it's full of terms and ideas that come from post-colonial theories, constructivism, all sorts of theories which you can track back to critical theory, and something that the Kremlin continuously incorporates into its disinformation. And we see these examples all the time. There was recently an intern at our office who kept using this term, and I'm sure you're all familiar with it. Collective West. Whenever he would say Collective West, and I'm like, we do not use Russian propaganda terms in our work. So you know what he said? He's like, oh, but this is the term that my professors at this and this UK university use. And I'm like, well, I'm sorry to tell you, but your professors they haven't done their homework, to put it, mildly. And sometimes I still keep getting shocked about, all these quote unquote smart people that, they can be smart, but they can also be useful for someone else.
Yeah, well, obviously, like the academic community is also at a bit of a crossroads because they're so used to, especially historians and IR experts, they're so used to analyzing the past that whenever something is happening in the present, they're a bit like, I don't have all the information, but I'm going to make a, educated guess. But then you have expertise falling into advocacy and it becomes rather different because it's not as objectively sound and evidence-based. So, and then you get people trying to use their views. And as you say, it becomes a very good proliferator of misinformation.
Well, and the Mearsheimer-Heinian NATO expansion one is just the best because it's like, he is still insisting at every juncture, this war was caused by NATO expansion, whatever. How many times does Putin have to come out and say he's trying to extinguish the Ukrainian people? I mean, you're exactly right. It ignores evidence that's literally like right in your face. If it doesn't fit the theory, it doesn't exist. It's amazing the extent to which these guys are fundamentally advocates. And it's also amazing the extent to which they have essentially laundered Russian talking points into intellectual discourse. That is so dangerous. And honestly, when I look at kind of the decision-making and the thinking of top US officials, top German officials, top French officials, you see it everywhere. The one place you don't really see it, amazingly, is top British officials. The Brits have a little bit of a nose for this. I couldn't believe it because the Russians owned London. I was sure the Brits were going to have trouble, but they don't really. I don't know what it is. I mean, maybe it's just they have kind of the nose for the Russians, more than a lot of other Westerners, given they've, faced down the Russians many times before. But I don't know what it is, but they don't seem to fall for it like all of us do.
Well, I think we can always blame it on island mentality. Like, they feel like they're separated from us, so they're not.
Yeah, true. But wait, what about us? we have no excuse. We're on the other side of the world. I mean, we're an ocean away. I mean, honestly, I look at some Americans and I'm just like, oh my God, man, what is wrong with you? Like, I mean, of course, there is a set of straight talking, smart American that has kind of the common sense, which to me is Thomas Paine's common sense. That is the quintessential American mentality that can see through this sort of thing and be like, come on, like what? That's ridiculous, you know? But I'm amazed the extent to which these talking points really, really influence the debate a lot more than anything else. And when you think about disinformation, I really do think that's what you should be focused on.
In terms of countering, whether we're talking about media or universities and just discourse in general, but particularly the media and the university and the academic sector, you seem to be running into kind of the same issue, which is really all about, well, we as democratic societies afford media and universities levels of protection. Like it's a very high barrier that you have to pass before you can like do a public policy intervention that targets media or universities. And there's a good reason for that, right? It all has to do with the principles of freedom of speech and freedom of the press, et cetera, et cetera. And that's how it should be. But it's also one of the reasons why we don't like talking about deterrence measures that basically look at how you can limit the supply of this information, whether it be in media or academic circles, but we prefer talking about preventative measures, which basically kind of sideline this whole issue of intervening into these, quite sensitive sectors, and where it's all about regaining people's trust in media, in democratic institutions, in what your own government has to say instead of trusting someone else's government. What would be your opinion in terms of like fighting the supply and the demand? Should we focus on one? Do both need to happen in parallel?
I think there's a few things you could do to counter both. I think that one thing, of course, is purely kind of like transparency and anti-corruption measures. Like one thing that makes this stuff possible is funding. And when this funding comes straight from the CCP or from Russia or from intermediaries, that's bad. And we should know about it. And in some cases, it is illegal too. Not in all cases, but even when it's not illegal, we should know that it's where it's funded from. The public style role that these places want to fulfill kind of obligates them, I would say, to tell us where the funding's coming from. I mean, you're out there in the public arena telling us your views and telling us why we should believe something. Can we know who you're funded by? I think that's a very normal request. And I think we need that for think tanks. I think we need that for universities. I think we need that for everybody. Obviously, they shouldn't be taking money from sanctioned individuals. They shouldn't be, they shouldn't be, in a lot of cases, former officials. Really, we can regulate former officials, for example, and we shouldn't have them working for foreign regimes, particularly adversaries. I mean, it is absolutely beyond belief that there's a former German chancellor still working for Putin. I mean, what? Gerhard Schroeder is an utter embarrassment to Germany, to Europe, to the West, to democratic values. I mean, it's unbelievable. Probably the most corrupt man alive right now. And I say that knowing there's Putin and Xi and all that kind of stuff, because really Schroeder should know better. I mean, give me a break. He's from a rule of law society. Come on.
Just to corroborate what you were saying about funding, with a really recent example, which I thought was interesting, there was recently a burning of a Quran in Sweden. This wasn't the first case. There was also a case back in January. Afterwards, it emerged that the protest where the burning happened was funded by a far-right journalist, Swedish journalist, who himself had previous links to Kremlin-controlled outlets. So it just goes to show how pernicious and the long arm of the Kremlin.
And they understand our cleavages, and they're going to try to exacerbate every political cleavage in every single one of our countries. So the other thing we can do, and I think is very important, is, and again, I do not advocate, I think you're exactly right. Freedom of speech is sacrosanct. I do not advocate any limits on freedom of speech. But I mean, I'm an American in that regard. I think the First Amendment is the most important thing we've ever established in this country. It's the most important part of the Constitution. But one thing we can do is, I have freedom of speech too. I'm a government employee, but I have freedom of speech. And so do a lot of other people. And we need to flood the zone with truth. We need to have more podcasts like this. We need to be tweeting. We need to be out there. We need to be on shows. We need to be talking. We have this kind of mentality, I'm sad to say, in the West. Again, this is from the liberal triumphalism in the last 30 years of technocratic government, where we're going to do a press release. Okay, let's take 3 weeks to make sure we take anything interesting out of it and turn it into this ridiculous, document that no one will read and it'll get 3 views and nobody will care. This is coming from the country, all right? The United States is the king of marketing. I mean, the freaking world culture is like in large part like marketed by us, and yet our government can't market anything. Why is that? Like, I mean, it's embarrassing. I mean, I just don't understand why we do this to ourselves. I mean, I see it myself. I see it in all these institutions. Like, even if they want to institutionally do a tweet, they have to run it through like a 2-week. Hey, anybody got something to put on this? And then what? They put it up. It's like, okay, I tweeted it out on the email chain, and it gets like 3 likes. I mean, come on. You think this is how Russia is operating? They have a free market of misinformation. They just, the FSB is like, here's $1 million, go cause a lot of problems. I mean, why aren't we doing this in the opposite way? I don't want to cause problems, but why aren't we going to people and saying, here's $1 million, go spread the truth? Because people are attracted to the truth. The thing is we're always worried about media literacy. I mean, media literacy, even if you're the most media literate person, if you are surrounded by misinformation your whole life, how can you possibly be media literate? Like, I mean, if you just don't have access to the truth, how can you know the truth? So you need to push the truth out constantly, and you'll be ridiculed, and it's hard and it's whatever, but it's like, that's life. But we need to build the mentality of doing this, because part of our problem is we become so, we're on the railings of the Titanic, right? And we're hanging on for dear life, and the ship's going down, and we're just like, oh God, I just don't want to let the rail go. I don't want to, it's like, get to the lifeboats, I mean, like, do something. Patch the holes, start acting, stop hanging on to the guardrails, stop doing everything like it's been done before. The world has moved on. You need to be active to defend democracy. You need to be out there. You need to take some punches. I know it's uncomfortable, but that's what our founding fathers did. And that's what the people that fought and won the Civil War did. And that's what the people that fought and won against the Nazis did. And that's what the people that fought and won against the Soviets did. I mean, come on. I know this is very American in perspective now. But I mean, it frustrates me to no end the way we take this stuff on in America, and then we wonder why we have all these nut jobs running circles around everything. It's because they're authentic. It's because they're interesting. It's because they flood the zone with what they believe, and that's the same reason you have Russia running things too. And then where's the truth? Nobody can find it. So it doesn't matter, even if you're the smartest person in the world, if you can't find the truth, you can't believe the truth.
No, that's very true. And I think that also speaks to the experience in Europe, where we're so bogged down in bureaucracy and double checking everything. And kind of like the bogus stories are the ones that are flooding the space, while, the institutions or even the civil society, for example, here in Bulgaria, it's very slow to catch up with. By the time we catch up with the fake news, it's already old news. The attention span is so small these days that when you send, you have to be just more on your feet, as you say, and you really need to, because that's kind of preempting it as well. Because at the end of the day, if you're just constantly peeling out the truth, as you say, it's the best preemption you can do, because you can't know what narrative they're going to come up with, but your side of the story.
We're so scared of putting out something that could be interpreted as controversial, and we're so scared of possibly making something that could be interpreted as a mistake. We massively overestimate the impact of making a mistake, and we totally underestimate the impact of inaction. When you don't act, you are making a decision not to act, and you are making a decision not to speak, and that itself has consequences, and that's what's happened over 30 years.
I completely agree with your point, and I think something that we should all be cognizant of is just imagining what situation and the type of discussions we will be having right now if things didn't happen the way they did. I mean, if the Ukrainian armed forces weren't able to hold back the hordes, because that's essentially what they're doing, they're holding back the hordes at the gates of Europe. Now, what discussion we would be having if it turned more in Putin's favor, the war, or if what they were hoping to achieve, they actually achieved. And it's worthy to think about what the reaction from, let's say, German or French leadership would be, because based on what they're currently doing, I could totally see them just sort of waving the white flag. Said differently, Ukraine's success, defensive success, has sort of inadvertently served to hide our own failures. Our failures, our diplomatic failures, our even military failures, and we really shouldn't allow that to prevent us from, thinking about what we did wrong and thinking about how we should proceed in the future. Because as it stands, Ukraine's relatively successful defense, much more successful than anyone would have imagined in the beginning of 2022, has served to hide their own failures. And I think that Europe is still struggling with some leftover anti-American sentiments that French and German leadership are sort of exploiting and are abusing for their own political for their own political gain. It's easy to win elections with that sort of rhetoric, or at least that seems to be something that they're relying on. But we should really think about what the world would look like without that American perspective that you just provided, because, it's my firm belief that we would be living in a much more dangerous and risk-filled world without that perspective, if something were to happen to that. And I think Ukraine exemplifies that as well, because I would wager that the war would have gone very differently if not for the massive support from the US and maybe to a lesser extent the UK and of course the EU. But it's always the US that is driving these processes, something that we have to admit. It's the US that is pushing a lot of the time. Now, of course, this does depend on, who's in power, whether it's Democrats or Republicans. They do have these quite different, especially in the last years.
Well, it's our alliance. Bulgaria is an extremely close ally of the United States. And I mean, God bless NATO, God bless the EU, and we need to be closer. I mean, that's the bottom line is we need to be closer because that's how we're going to close ranks and protect our systems and our lifestyles. And I mean, really just basic human freedom at the end of the day. The presence of our alliance and our example has been good for mankind. I mean, we live with more freedom and human dignity than ever in history. And I hope we continue expanding that and we recognize what a massive value we are.
Thank you so much, Paul, for taking the time to speak with us. And thank you, Goran, for also taking the time. Thanks for tuning in to CSD's podcast this week. We hope you enjoyed our discussion and gained some new insights. If you want to stay updated on future episodes, be sure to visit our website, csd.bg, or find us on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter so you never miss a show. If you found value in today's episode, we would greatly appreciate it if you could share the episode with your network. Your support helps us continue to bring you thought-provoking conversations. That's all from us for now.